Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to that edition of the European Strategy Dialogue, which is a joint cooperation of the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, the University of Bonn, the Center of Advanced Strategic Studies here at Bonn, and the Sorbonne University in Paris, and the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, Brussels. And we have had a lot of editions already of this series, and we are looking at the European security landscape, especially since the Russian invasion in Ukraine, but also in a more general way. We have had sessions on what does European sovereignty mean, European sovereignty versus autonomy. Is that something we want to work for, or are there risks related to that? We had another session, the last one actually, where we looked at national security strategies. We looked in particular at the French one, the Dutch one, and at the German debate, but also we looked at what has happened in Brussels, the strategic compass of the European Union and the strategic concept of NATO, and how these different national security strategies are linking up with that. And today we are looking in particular at the angle of UK-European relations, UK-EU, but further than that, because when we look at the European security landscape, it is very clear that we need some kind of cooperation with the British, and the Brexit has made that somewhat more difficult, but alas, the British are still in NATO, and we are looking for ways and means how we can further cooperate. Our next edition is probably about the triangle between Europe, China, and the US, and what is foreboding here, and how are the different answers to the questions raised in this context. But we'll be getting in touch with everybody listening to us today about the next edition when we have decided the date. And with this, I'll pass over the floor to Jeroen, who is actually the representative of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation in Brussels, and Jeroen is our moderator for the European Strategy Dialogue. Thank you very much for your attention and your participation, and I, as I said, pass the floor to Jeroen. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dirk, for the introduction, and welcome also on my behalf. My name is Jeroen Dobber, and as Dirk said, I work for the Friedrich Naumann Foundation in Brussels. I'm responsible there for the Global Security Hub, which is our internal structure to work on global security and defense policies. And I will moderate the discussion this evening. The topic that we want to talk about is EU-UK security relations. And we would like to follow up on a few developments that have taken place recently. So kind of in the past year or so, the most recent developments, also the integrated review refresh, which was published by the UK, and where things are heading. I think that's, of course, the most important part of the discussion. So some of the questions that we would like to discuss is like, so how has it changed in the UK, but also in other EU member states? To what extent are the threat analyses in the UK and the EU or different EU member states aligned? And also very important, where do they differ? How much potential is there for closer cooperation? Also in what domains could that take place? And what role can the EU and the UK also play outside Europe? And also the topic of broader cross-European cooperation is something we would like to discuss, especially in the framework of the European, or the discussions on the framework of the European political community. A lot of questions and only about 80 minutes left. So hopefully we have the time to discuss them all. We're joined by a group of stellar panelists this evening, who not only have great research experience on the topics that we would like to discuss, but also come from different countries and can perhaps comment a bit from both points of view. We are joined, I'll give a brief introduction. We are joined by Jana Pugliarin, who is a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and the head of their Berlin office. Rem Korteweg, who is a senior research fellow at the Klingendael Institute in the Netherlands. Mathieu Drouin, a visiting fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And Georgina Wright, who is a senior fellow and director at the Institut Montaigne, or the Europe program of the Institut Montaigne. Thank you all for joining. That's very much appreciated. Before we start going with the discussion, I would like to do some brief kind of housekeeping. The session will last until 7:30. So I will start off with a few first questions to the panelists to start the discussion. But after that, I would like to invite all the participants in the channel or in the event at the moment to ask their questions and write them in the Q&A function. You'll find that at the bottom of the screen. Please try to keep them short and concise because we would like to get as many of them answered as possible. Please also feel free to post on social media about this event or comments if you find that interesting. It's a public event. And lastly, about 5 minutes before we end, I will try to wrap up the discussion so that we can all have dinner at a reasonable, still reasonable time. On that note, I would like to start the discussion with a first question. And as we're talking about EU-UK relations, I would like to start with the UK and the kind of developments that have taken place there politically and also in the security landscape. And I would like to ask Georgina about that. If you could give a first kind of insight into, from your point of view, what has happened there over the past year. Maybe you could also tell us a bit about the integrated review refresh that was published quite recently on the 13th of March this year, and where things are heading there.
Great, thank you very much, Haroon. I hope everyone can hear me. So all excellent questions. I mean, I think the first thing to note is we really have seen a visible UK on obviously the European stage, but also beyond. And I think, you know, Brexit feels like a very long time ago, but that was one of the fears of many EU governments, was just to have a UK that would turn away from Europe. Of course, the war in Ukraine has really sort of, you know, drilled down and made sure that the UK, you know, sort of made sure that the UK was fully focused on that. But nonetheless, I think it has gone a long way to reassure a number of EU countries, including France, because the EU is thinking, the UK is thinking strategically about the EU beyond Ukraine as well. So looking to sort of bolster alliances with individual EU governments, being much more active in small groups of EU nations, but also looking at other threats that are you know, threatening the whole of Europe. So I'm thinking, for example, illegal migration, but also some of the kind of instability from North Africa that could spill over as well. You're absolutely right to say that the UK published a sort of refresh of its integrated review, which was the blueprint of Global Britain in Action. I think in 2021, when it first appears, the main message was, you know, where does the UK stand in a world marked by greater confrontation and multipolarity? And fast forward 2 years later, in 2023, it was very much a world that was contested. And I think that sort of shift from kind of greater cooperation that could be benign or malign to actually being contested really focused minds in London on being absolutely clear who allies were. The Euro-Atlantic is not only a key focus, it's really the top focus, I think, for the UK government. There was also a lot of new language, I think, around the Indo-Pacific, so much tougher on China. Talking there again about the sort of importance of alliances. And I think it was interesting to see the UK define China as an epoch-defining challenge in sort of a three-pronged approach, which is you protect the UK, and you protect its allies, you align where you can, and you engage China when you can as well. So it isn't signaling alignment with the United States, and I think that's important. In fact, I think much more closer position between the UK and the EU on China. As I said, I think the other big focus was on sort of bilateral relationships. The EU, including the EU, so the EU is no longer a taboo, but I think you'll see a UK really trying to work through minilateral groups and small groups. And so you see the Joint Expeditionary Force, for example, which brings together the UK and Nordic countries and part of Baltic countries. That's very active, and I think we'll see willingness for the UK to do more on that. And then finally, maybe on defence, because in 2021, when the UK published its integrated review, it was very much criticised about, yeah, it's all well and good saying you're going to do all of this, but how are you going to do it? You know, you've experienced defence cuts. Well, there too, there is, I think, much more flesh in what the UK was promising. So £5 billion of additional funding to, you know, bolster ammunition stocks and the nuclear fleet, of course, in response to the AUKUS deal, so the deal between the UK, the US and Australia. Also 24 billion over the next 4 years for sort of more defence expenditure, including on the army, and then a lot on sort of science and tech. So this realisation that actually it's not just about hard defence capabilities, it's about smart defence capabilities. So I think to sort of, you know, in a nutshell, a UK that's very much present, a UK that's prepared to work with its allies and is clear on who its allies are, including the EU. And I think a UK that's pretty much been, you know, not faultless, but not far from that in its response to the Ukraine war. And I think that's, you know, that's credit to London. And there are lots of things that I'm doubtful of, but maybe we can come back to that in the debates. I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot for that, Georgina, and maybe we can continue talking about some of those bilateral relationships also with the other speakers. I would like to ask Mathieu about that first, because so France is traditionally a very strong security partner of the UK. At the political level, relationships have been difficult in the previous few years, but it seems that things have opened up a bit again recently. Could you tell us something about the kind of the changes that have happened in France also after Russia's invasion of Ukraine? How the kind of France's security landscape has changed or is perceived to have changed, and also how the relationship with the UK, the security relationship with the UK, feeds into that.
Yes, absolutely, and thanks for having me in such a great company. It's a pleasure to be here. So you're right. I mean, the past few years have been very complicated in the French UK relationship. I mean, ever since Brexit started. But you're also right to say that the French-UK relationship in terms of security and defense is historic, and it's very strong as the two main military powers in Europe, two nuclear powers, two expeditionary militaries. So basically the United Kingdom is the country with which France has the most interactions when it comes to security and defense. There have been a lot of tensions of a wide array of issues, not only militaries, but migration, fisheries, and it's probably reached a climax with the AUKUS affair, you know, this security partnership between Australia, the UK, and US on building submarines, which scrapped a major contract for France. So at this point of time, the relations soared to a point that there was basically no more, almost no more bilateral engagement, except on daily business and important issues. But I think the change really happened with Rishi Sunak. He really shown eagerness to re-engage not only with France but with Europe in general. And I think starting with showcasing the re-engagement with France was a strong signal, not only for France but also for the rest of Europe, that we're going to engage into a better footing. So this was all showcased during the March 10th summit, which was the first for the past 5 years. The last one was in Sandhurst in 2018. And so this was really a way to show that relations are back on track. And basically, if you look at the declaration that came at the end of the summit, you can see a lot of convergences which are not which are actually real. I mean, you were talking about the strategic outlook and the threats perception and threat analysis. French and UK threat perceptions are very, very similar in a wide array of topics, from Africa to Middle East to Indo-Pacific. So I think they have identified a number of avenues to work on a bilateral basis. I won't enumerate them all. We'll certainly have more chances to come back on them in the discussion. But that's basically where we are now.
Thanks a lot for that summary, Mathieu. I think there are a few points that we can come back to later on. But before, I would like to turn to another bilateral relationship, which is the relationship with Germany, another important partner, of course, which has gone through its own watershed moment with the Zeitenwende. Jana, I was wondering if you could tell us something about, with that development, how the bilateral relations between Germany and the UK have changed. Does that play a role in the Zeitenwende discussions? And if so, what kind of role?
Thank you very much. So, as you have said with the Zeitenwende, I think we have coined a new German word that is now well known, not only in Europe, but in the world, right after kindergarten. I think you cannot underestimate the change that Germany has gone through in the recent 15 months. It's actually a sea change in foreign security and defense policy. When it comes to Russia, it's the end of this idea to have a cooperative security model with Russia, and it's basically the end of what the Germans have dearly embraced as an idea to organize European security with Moscow. And now, for the foreseeable future, I think there is broad agreement that it needs to be organized against Russia. So there is alignment with the British threat perception, I think, in a sense that Russia is identified as threat number one. I mean, I would love to talk about the new our new national security strategy, which is not published, which was supposed to be published, and I guess that is just my gut feeling that Russia will be the number one threat there as well. But of course we have to wait and see until it's finally published. But that is that has been the epicenter of Germany's thinking lately. But with that, there is also the shift of the German armed forces towards territorial defense, to make territorial defense and in a way NATO the cornerstone also of what Germany focuses on. Although on paper, Germany will remain committed, I think, to doing crisis management and also to working with partners in the Indo-Pacific. But the Chancellor has on numerous occasions said that that kind of the main purpose for the German armed forces would be to defend German territory and NATO territory. Also, but kind of more broadly on security and defense, with the special fund Sondervermögen of 100 billion euro and the commitment to 2%, I think, Germany is going to invest much more in its capabilities and will become a much more capable actor in Europe. Our threat perception when it comes to China, I think, is also more closely aligned with that of the UK in recent years. It has already started prior to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, already basically for a couple of years, we see serious rethinking in Germany when it comes to relationship with China, not so much in the military domain, that too, but very much when it comes to resilience, economic coercion, the question of how dependent can one afford to be. All that I think links very well with the UK. However, and here I think there is maybe a slight difference, or maybe first another similarity, which is maybe somewhat also worrisome. I think like the UK focuses clearly on Russia and China in a different way, but still, I think in Germany, de facto, not on paper, we also see not a neglect, but maybe, yeah, regions like the Middle East, Africa, the Arctic playing not second fiddle. It's still very, very important, but when it comes to German capabilities and what Germany can do realistically, when it comes to crisis management, for example, I think we will see reduced ambition and appetite to get engaged. And I have recently been to the UK and talked with some security experts there, and I think we see the same trend. So when it comes to expeditionary missions, model Afghanistan or Libya, all that I think is no longer really something that Germany sees itself doing, although not ruling out anything on paper. But where I think we see some differences when it comes to the UK is that Germany remains a very committed supporter of international organizations, especially the European Union, but also NATO. And it's very much operating in the framework of the European Union and NATO. Germany, I think, is well known for having this love affair with the institutions and being highly suspicious of everything that undermines these institutions. And so Germany is still true to itself when it comes to the European political community. I mean, something that the French basically have invented and that the British have endorsed is highly suspicious from a German perspective. But also when it comes to the British approach to bilateralisms, so not to focus on the EU first and foremost, but to strike bilateral deals with all sorts of European countries. That is something where I think Germany has proven to be more open and is looking forward to working closely with the UK, but never at the expense of the European Union and European cohesion. And I think that is very important, that in the past year, especially in the beginning, when there was this beauty contest a bit between London and Berlin and who delivers more weapon to Ukraine, and then kind of the UK also having this very close relationship with Northern Europe, and all this talk about a split in the European Union, basically the Northeast versus the Southwest, that was all not to Berlin's liking. So what we want is to work together with the UK in a framework that strengthens NATO, but also that is not undermining the European Union. So we don't want to establish all sorts of sideshows, I think, to put it in a nutshell.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Jana. And that I think that's an interesting last point. Also, as Georgina mentioned before, that is actually a strategy of the UK to have those kind of bilateral or kind of smaller constellations to work with. That actually brings us to Rem, because the Netherlands is actually in part of one of those smaller constellations with the Joint Expeditionary Force. Traditionally also a strong kind of security but also political partner of the UK, but has taken on a new role within the EU after, or has had to take on a new role in the EU after Brexit. And I was wondering, Rem, if you could talk us through kind of how the Netherlands is developing that role in the EU, but also how it's developing its relations with the UK now after Brexit, especially in the security area. And maybe you could tell a bit more, because there's now also this F-16 alliance or coalition that the Netherlands and the UK started. What that signifies exactly.
Sure, Jeroen, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's fantastic to share a panel with Georgina and Jana and Mathieu, and the only thing I regret is that we have to do it online, because it would have been all that more fun to have us all together in one room. In a way, I also applaud the organizers for spending time on the EU-UK or the Europe-UK relationship, because in all honesty, it's been pushed back a little bit from the front pages. And that's probably something we should all applaud, but it's worth pausing for a moment on that. Not too long ago, we were reading headlines about a maritime confrontation off of the island of Jersey because of so-called fish disputes between the UK and France. A couple of months before that, we would be concerned, or a couple of months after that, we would be concerned by remarks by certain Liz Truss that the jury was still out whether France was a friend or a foe. And not too long before that, we were all struck with a certain degree of shock and awe when the British Prime Minister compared Ukraine's struggle for freedom to Britain's decision to leave the European Union. Luckily, those days are gone. Long may that be the case. And so I think it's worth really pausing on how much difference a year makes, how much the mood has improved, how significant the characters of British prime ministers is in terms of shaping the post-Brexit relationship. Because also, mind you, we haven't had an election in the UK. There's not been a general election since 2019. But still, we've had marked differences in the style and tone coming from Westminster, coming from British prime ministers in terms of their relationship with Europe and the European Union. And that, I think, is something to pause on. So to your question, yes, I mean, in the Netherlands, we've also, of course, been struck by the degree to which, of course, the mood has improved over the past year, and also how that's opened up space for different types of conversations with the British from a bilateral point of view, but also in the context of Ukraine. So from a bilateral point of view, I think there's a very intensive dialogue when it comes to security cooperation. That security cooperation primarily focuses on what can be done in a NATO context or in a JEF context. But also bilaterally, it's worth reflecting on. There is a new area of bilateral UK-Netherlands security cooperation in terms of securing the North Sea. And with that, I mean particularly the infrastructure, the pipelines, the electricity networks that are already laid or are being planned in the context of the overarching energy transition. Because one of the big initiatives that came out of a group of 8 European Union member states, but has since expanded to also include Norway and the UK, is to basically turn the North Sea into the wind powerhouse of Europe, but also to attract a lot of investment for hydrogen. And both of them together, both wind power and hydrogen generation, are effectively a response to the Ukraine shock or the Russia shock in our energy systems. And so the whole question of how to move away from our dependency on Russian gas means that the North Sea is going to be that much more important. And there's a very important security dimension which plays a role there as well. A lot of this is bilateral. Some of it is also actually part of what's been called the North Seas energy cooperation. And so it's also a mini-lateral element. Now, when it comes to the JEF, The Netherlands is strongly in favor of the JEF, as it is in favor of deeper military integration with its main land force partner, with Germany, as it is in terms of cooperating with France on a number of bilateral security initiatives. So it's not that the Netherlands has put all its eggs in one basket, but it applauds the fact that the JEF is playing an important role also in terms of securing the Baltic and in bringing in the northern dimension into a broader northwestern European security conversation. I think there's a lot of room for further, Dutch-British collaboration. We see this in the context of the Ukraine war with the F-16 initiative that you note. As a somewhat sort of frivolous remark, I would have you note that the folks in The Hague are somewhat amazed by how the UK has been able to attract a lot of attention to the fact that it will host the infrastructure for the F-16 training programs when the UK doesn't itself fly F-16s. And so they applaud the UK for the diplomatic coup in terms of creating the impression that the UK is going to be training all these pilots, when actually it's primarily providing the infrastructure and the airfields. But that cooperation is very deep, and I've been surprised, and it's also a testament again to the power of British political personalities, how well regarded Ben Wallace is. In The Hague, he comes by quite regularly for conversations and for coordination with his Dutch counterpart. And that is a very strong connection. Now, on your broader point about how the Netherlands has changed or has had to change its politics as a consequence of Brexit, I mean, we can talk longer or shorter about this. I would simply say that what Brexit has showed is that the Netherlands actually decided to double down on the European Union. Yes, traditionally, the Netherlands has always focused its security policy on both investing in EU integration as well as in NATO. That hasn't gone away, but it's decidedly made this point of deepening European defense integration efforts. For instance, pushing really for a stronger role for PESCO, for the European Defense Fund, for also supporting a lot of the EU initiatives coming out of the response to the Ukraine war. I'd stop with one perhaps interesting factoid, is that the Netherlands has been pushing permanent structured cooperation in an EU context, but also lobbying very strongly to open up PESCO projects for third countries, namely for the UK. And we see this now very clearly in the military mobility package, which the UK has now also formally signed up to. And this, I think, is testament to how the Netherlands views this new reality. Is yes, they deplore Brexit. Yes, they would like to see deeper security and defense cooperation between the UK and EU institutions. But given where we are, let's try to make the best of it and ensure that there are modalities for bringing in the UK as much as possible. Let me leave it there.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Rem. That was a very comprehensive overview, I think. Just a quick follow-up question on the first point that you made about the kind of relations with the UK disappearing from the headlines, and whether to see that as a positive or a bad sign. Is that you think because there's also not so much political will to move ahead on bigger projects, and there's a kind of things have moved to a working level, or is there also from the Netherlands a big push to further engage in with UK relations?
Well, I mean, others can talk to this, speak to this as well, but I don't think it's purely something that features in the Netherlands. I think this is a broader European phenomenon, that there isn't as much attention being paid to Brexit and the post-Brexit environment as there was a couple of years, if not months ago. And probably that's a good thing. Probably that's a good thing, because it does allow the politicians to take a little bit of a step back and allow the working level to do what it does best, and to ensure that relationships can be built and trust can be rediscovered, because that's what I think personally has been missing most, is that there was a tremendous dent given at the political level to mutual trust for whatever reason. And that needs to be rebuilt, and you rebuild it through practical cooperation, through doing stuff together. And so the fact that it's no longer an issue in the headlines is, I think, a good thing. Now, why is that? I think it's a matter of the political change that we've seen in the British political landscape. But I think we've also perhaps reached the limit of what the current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, can push for, because he is receiving pushback from within his own party, as well as from the DUP, in terms of what the Windsor framework means for the new relationship, whether through the European political community he is being lured into those aren't my words, by the way. These are words of sort of the Brexiteers in the UK political system, but that he's being lured into deepening relations with the EU with the intent of kind of drawing back the UK into the EU's orbit. So he has to really pay attention. And for me, the main moment where we can really talk about any type of recalibration or further deepening of that security and defense relationship is going to come after the next elections, if then. Yeah.
Thanks. I see that Jana put her hand up, and in the meantime, so please, Jana, I will. Please feel free to go ahead. I will just mention to the other participants in the session that it is possible to ask your questions also in this Q&A function. So feel free to ask your questions there as well. Jana, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize what Rem has just said, but at least that is the perception here in Berlin, that everybody is very happy to see basically the end of this global Britain fantasy and Britain returning to a partnership-based approach, Britain being more eager to work with the Europeans. But still, I think in Berlin, the perception is that the fundamental dynamics between the UK and the EU relationship remain the same. Maybe less toxic, but that kind of the current government cannot work miracles, and that it needs another government, and even there room for maneuver might be somewhat limited. And we have seen very tough negotiations, and even though I think Sunak and von der Leyen get along well, there is no real basis kind of or strategic basis, kind of, or a joint strategic vision, what basically the EU and the UK in foreign security and defense policy can do together. So that's how I would describe the atmosphere here as well. So very positive, but not overemphasizing, what the signals we get, because the signals which Berlin has got recently was really that the UK has reached out on a bilateral ticket, kind of how to strengthen the UK-German relationship. And the Germans have then always emphasized that basically the heart to the Germans goes always through Brussels, and that the relationship with Brussels needs to improve, and only then can also the bilateral relationship prosper. Just wanted to highlight this.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Jana. And Georgina, I already wanted to ask your take on that as well, but I see that you put your hand up, so please feel to go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. So it was great to come after brilliant speakers. I mean, I think we, the sort of fear that the UK is pushing a bilateral approach, that's not fear, that's just strategy. That is what the UK is trying to do. I mean, they've been, the thing is that I think they've understood, or at least Sunak's government, but even Liz Truss's government had already, started to change slightly and sort of were open to attending some foreign affairs council meetings. And in fact, she did when she was foreign secretary, before she became prime minister. There's a realization in London that you can't do bilateralism with individual member states while completely ignoring the EU. But that does not mean, that realization does not mean a huge openness and willingness to engage with the EU at all levels. And I think we need to be completely honest with that. I think, what the Labour Party's been quite sort of not strategic, but quite quiet about what it would do differently. I think that's partly because there are a lot of bipartisan, basically consensus, whether it's approach to China, not rejoining the EU, not rejoining the single market or customs union, Labour's position. So the Labour Shadow Secretary David Lammy published a piece, I think in Foreign Affairs or Foreign Policy, sort of outlining Labour's view, but it wasn't sort of the level of detail I think that many people were hoping for, but it was like a more constructive relationship with the EU without really sort of giving away much of what that meant. And I think also there was a realization in London that yes, trust was an issue, and particularly if you've got a bad relationship with the EU, it blocks you from furthering your relationship with individual capitals. But there was also, and I think you all touched upon this, a need to kind of have a working, sort of re-establish a working pattern with individual governments, because a lot of the meetings happens basically on the sidelines of EU meetings, and it's a quick chat, and are you doing this and are you doing that, and our advisors can see each other, and none of that really happens anymore. But I think it's worth sort of seeing the glass half full. If you want closer UK-EU cooperation. I mean, James Mackey is a junior minister in the MOD, so Ministry of Defence, attended the EU's inaugural Schuman Security and Defence Forum in March. Which is like an informal meeting, but it was to discuss everything, I believe, from arms procurement to EU-led initiatives. I think the Franco-British statement, while it didn't have any major announcements, it did say that France would support UK involvement in EU-led initiatives. So things are moving, but I think we need to sort of place that in a context that there's not going to be a radical pivot to kind of, UK is not going to try and be the EU's closest partner. But if we see it as an improvement on what was before, then I think we can definitely see it as a half full. And then just on Rem's point about a general election, I mean, I think everyone was relieved, frankly, with the 2015 general election, Brexit, then the 2017 general election, 2019 general election. I think everyone's quite happy for that to be on pause in the UK. But I agree with everyone that there is more to be done, and I suspect the UK government knows that too.
How is thanks, Georgina. A quick follow-up question on that. How so at the same time on the EU side, things are developing as well, or at the EU level, as in there's a push for more integration of security and defense on the security and defense area. How is that viewed from a UK point of view? Is that something which is seen as harmful to UK political interests, at least? Or is that seen in a positive light, also given the UK's participation in PESCO, for instance, now?
I'll be very quick because Mathieu wants to intervene, but I think it depends who you talk to. A lot of people are quite skeptical that this willingness to integrate more will actually lead to further integration. I mean, we've been talking about years about what the EU can do. More, how it could be a more strategic defence actor. And I think even with the publication of the Strategic Compass, which was this EU document outlining defence priorities, after we haven't really spoken about it much. So I think most people are kind of wait and see approach. I think where there is concern is deepening of the defence market, so defence industry or industrial cooperation, because there is very clearly a push by certain member states, including France, to sort of make it very much an EU focus and kind of exclude defence companies from bidding for procurement or whatever inside the EU. And I think that is more of a worry in the UK, of being excluded from that. But I think it's also, London's also received some positive signals from individual capitals saying that they would lobby to open it up, not just to the UK but to the US. So again, I think at the moment they're not that concerned because they're like, well, let's wait and see. So I guess that it will depend on what the EU does.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that clarification. Sorry to keep you waiting, Mathieu, but please go ahead.
No problem. I just wanted to complete the loop on the on the perception, and I think I basically agree with whatever has been said. But I think one aspect that I think hasn't been mentioned is also the Brexit fatigue. I think on both sides of the channel, and I've seen polls recently. I don't remember the exact figures, but how low is the perception, even in the UK, of the benefits from Brexit, and that also gives some leeway to the government to engage further with Europe. And also, I totally share the skepticism of Jana towards the prospects of serious and fruitful EU-UK engagement. But I think we, especially with the Windsor framework, we have passed that phase where the UK has to prove that Brexit was right. I mean, we're not here anymore, and I think on the European side, it's the same. And we have passed the phase where we have to prove that Brexit was wrong. I think now we all have a clear picture of what the effects of Brexit are, and that also gives some possibility to move forward. And now coming back on the UK EU question that you just raised, I think France is always criticized for the perception that it is playing the EU against NATO, and I think that's very true also that's been the case for the UK playing NATO against the EU in trying to bring some the instruments of power that it had with the EU, trying to bring it in NATO, pushing for a resilience agenda, trying to work on foreign investments, that kind of issues that are usually dealt by the EU. So I think the engagement will remain very pragmatic and very interested, because honestly, the UK has not much interest in being more involved in EU operations or missions, but I think they have a strong interest in whatever impacts their industrial base, because they have a lot of major industrial actors that are based on both sides. I mean, if you look at MBDA, Airbus, actors that play an important role even in the UK industrial base. And so I think whatever touches the defense industry, so that means PESCO, as one was mentioned, probably the future funds like the European Defense Investment Plan that the EU is working on, there will be an interest from London. But I think it's more pragmatic and interested rather than really a political push to engage more with the EU.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. Is that also? Do you think that that's where we should look for closer relations at this point in terms of the kind of domains in which we can work together? Would that be more in the defense industrial area, or are there other kinds of initiatives that you can think of that where there would actually be an opportunity to work together?
The question is for me?
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
It was a follow-up question.
Well, yeah. I mean, we also, from an EU perspective, the UK is knowledgeable in a lot of fields, and we have also to take advantage of UK's knowledge. I mean, I think there is already an agreement to set up dialogue groups on issues like cybersecurity, counterterrorism. These are definitely aspects where London has a lot to offer. Sanctions was definitely an area in which London has always been probably the best equipped European player, and so we have seen this coordination being put in practice in the response to Ukraine. So this is something that probably needs to be to have a clearer framework to work on. And yes, I mean, all the domains in which UK has expertise, the space domain, in the maritime domain, on nuclear and proliferation issues, there's certainly room for greater engagement when the time is mature.
Yeah. Thanks. I would like to ask the same question to the others as well. I saw you nodding when Mathieu started his answer. How is that viewed from a German point of view? What are the areas where there is room for further cooperation at this point?
Yeah, I think the Germans would be even more open to defense industrial collaboration and cooperation than the French. I mean, we were less outspoken than the Dutch, but I think Berlin was never as radical as France was when it comes to third-party access to PESCO or the EDF. So defense industrial cooperation, I think there is still some untapped potential. And in theory, the Germans, I think, would be in favor of opening up more, because from a German perspective, it is really, I mean, it is about making the EU work, not as a replacement for NATO, but as a hub. So as an attractive hub for European countries to work together. And if you don't have attractive dock-in mechanisms, then countries will cooperate elsewhere. And so from a German perspective, there is a greater readiness to build these docking mechanisms to avoid these minilateralisms like a second Jeff or whatever. So this is one thing, but I think another area where I see potential is really in securing long-term support for Ukraine, and not only militarily. I think the UK, I see the UK very committed when it comes to the future of Ukraine, but also in other areas, kind of when it comes to long-term support, but also rebuilding the country, all that I see potential. Then I think from a German perspective, it would be very much appreciated if the UK would show some responsibility to keep the European club together, even in NATO. So what I mentioned in the beginning, what we don't like to see is, for example, the German-Polish relationship is really in a miserable condition. And so whatever the UK could do also in a NATO framework, but to bring partners together again and to use its influence to make clear that rifts in the kind of Western camp are not good for anybody, that would be very much appreciated. So, and if it's now about developing a European pillar in NATO, as the UK says, to make sure that this goes hand in hand with a stronger EU, for example, when it comes to defense capability development, that it's not kind of for one or the other organization, but that it's kind of in an interlinked process, so that kind of both countries share a certain responsibility to make this function and not to make this a confrontation and a silo approach, as we've seen for so many years. So that the German idea would be to overcome the silo thinking of EU and NATO, and to bring the organizations closer together. And the UK could play a crucial role there. And I think other than that, everything where the E3 is also a crucial framework. So Iran was mentioned before, I think would be something where the EU would, I think, cooperate with, or want to cooperate with the UK. That would be also, I think, very important, that this would work hand in hand, and not that the two camps would not oppose each other when it comes to how to approach Iran.
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe we can talk a bit more about that later on. First, I would like to pass the floor to Rem, who raised his hand.
Yeah, thanks. Just very briefly, let me second what Joe mentioned regarding.
Sorry to interrupt, Rem. We hear an echo. I don't know if the others hear it as well. Could you
Yes.
mute and unmute yourself just to see if that's
Is this better?
No, unfortunately still an echo.
I didn't change anything, but let's see if this works.
And Jeroen, if you mute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, good. Apologies. The point I wanted to make is I wanted to second what Mathieu mentioned regarding the possibility of deeper cooperation on sanctions. Actually, sanctions cooperation has gone pretty well, but could be much improved if a more institutional setup was agreed. And so to Georgina's point, one of the things we really miss in the broader UK-EU, UK-European relationship are these side meetings. Side meetings at G7 summits happen, but they don't happen on a daily basis in an EU context or in a European context. There's something to the order of 20 or 25 moments every day where representatives and diplomats from the 27 EU member states meet each other, and where there are moments for interaction. That interaction is absent. Yes, the UK representation or the UK embassy in Brussels is doing its best, but a lot of the sanctions actually get coordinated because people simply pull each other aside in a meeting and say, like, wouldn't it be a good idea if ... And it would be great if we were able to reproduce some of that more sort of flexible interaction at both the senior political as well as the senior civil service levels. But I think we're doing as good as we can. One of the things that we haven't talked about, which struck me when reading the integrated review refresh, which I'm kind of hopeful that it might deliver some security results, is the European political community, and particularly the meeting in 2024. The reason I say it is if you read the refresh, it mentions it on a number of occasions that in 2024, the EPC will be hosted by the United Kingdom. It's like, okay, you know, it's so nice you say it twice. What are we expecting that the UK is going to deliver there? Apparently, there is some idea that this is a useful initiative. We know that there are ambitions that the EPC also starts to touch on security matters. Perhaps it's high-level diplomatic coordination, but even that would be very, very useful. So is the EPC a vehicle for allowing the UK to sort of return to the European family and to really drive the agenda on broader security themes outside of purely the military, which of course gets discussed in a NATO context? You know, it's an open question that I don't have the answer to, but I just find it quite striking how much emphasis on the EPC is put in the refresh. So, you know, from Georgina's glass half full perspective, let's keep our eyes open for that. Final point, which we also haven't talked about, is the United States. The US is very important to the UK. We see that in the integrated review refresh. It's very important in the context of the Ukraine war. It's a very important partner of the European Union, of every single EU member state. But there is some uncertainty in which direction the US might go over the next couple of years. And where does that lead to from a British point of view? It was already mentioned by, I think it was Georgina, that said, when it comes to China, actually the UK policy is much more European than it is US. Well, to what extent is that going to become more pronounced as we get into a US electoral season, where possibly because of domestic political pressure, the debate about China in the United States becomes that much more sharp? I was struck reading James Cleverly's comments that he's making the exact same, he's using the exact same rhetoric as Ursula von der Leyen is regarding de-risking, as many European leaders are when it comes to the necessity to not only confront but also engage China. And that leads me to wonder, well, should we enter a less favorable transatlantic space, what is that going to do for the UK's positioning? Right now, it seems to be doubling down on the relationship with the US. But how long will that last, and how is that going to tweak British foreign policy should that become a little bit more difficult to do, to rhyme with its own policies?
Yeah, thanks a lot for bringing up those topics, Rem. We're slowly working our way out, so that's always a nice order. I wanted to ask Georgina if you could maybe give on the first question, that the open question that Rem raised, is the EPC a vehicle for the UK to kind of return or get a closer position to the European family? Is that how do you see that? Did you read it as well like that in the integrated review refresh?
I mean, yeah, the British love the EPC, but that's also because they've been reassured on numerous occasions that it's not an enlarged EU. This is separate. It's to bring everyone round the table. You know, and as several people mentioned, that British diplomats don't see their EU counterparts as much as they did. So if this is an opportunity for twice a year to sort of meet in a general setting, but also bilateral meetings, then that's very good. I do think the British want deliverables, not necessarily announcements or anything like that, but they would like it to be less like, let's just all talk about some of the things that we are concerned about, to be it much more, okay, what could we actually practically do on energy security? What might we do on migration, even China? So I think there is a willingness to bring a theme, but I think the Brits aren't working in isolation on this. They're very much working with Moldova, with is it Spain that will hold the next one? Yeah, and then of course with France and others but yes, they've embraced it with much enthusiasm. So when Jana, you were saying there was skepticism in Berlin, I think they really liked it in the UK. There was a moment of trepidation when people started to suggest that this was a parking, for countries wanting to join the EU, and they're like, oh no, this is very different. But I think they've been reassured that this is something different, so they do like it, and I'm not surprised that, and frankly, it was very important for Paris and for Macron in particular to have the UK on board from the very start, because he thought, if this is going to have legs, we need to have non-EU countries, embrace it. So I think that was very important, and it did wonders to restore trust between Paris and London as well. On the US, I think it's a very difficult discussion to be had in London, because there's all this emphasis on special relationship. There's much more emphasis on the special relationship in London than there is in Washington, where it feels like Matthew is based in Washington, so maybe he can touch upon it. But it does sometimes feel like, when I talk to people there, that all member states or all EU countries are bidding to be the #1 partner of the United States on anything to do with Europe. So the UK is competing, and I think there's also a realization in London that the Biden administration has really tried to improve its relationship directly with the EU institutions. And so in a way that there was a realization that there were all sorts of discussions happening that didn't include the UK. But I'm sure people in London are thinking of what a different administration would look like in 2024, what the repercussions are. I think you're hearing things in James Cleverly's speeches about thinking about European security, what would becoming a more capable Europe. I think all of this is signaling, just in case the United States does decide that actually it needs to focus fully on Asia. But I'm not sure that that's a discussion that can be easily had with the EU, and frankly within the EU, because I think there are some member states that have a strong transatlantic reflex, and others that are more critical of the United States. So I think it's a difficult discussion all round, but I do think it's happening, to be not caught off guard.
Thanks, Georgina. Before asking the next question, I would like to once more bring up the possibility to ask questions in the Q&A function. This is the we still have about 25 minutes left to ask your burning questions to Rem, Jana, Georgina, or Mathieu, or all of them. So please feel free to make use of that possibility. Before we go to the US, I wanted to ask Jana a question, but I see that you just raised your hand. Go ahead, and maybe I'll ask it after what you wanted to say.
I just wanted to make the German position on the EPC a bit clearer, because I think when Macron brought it up, the first reaction, and I'm a think tanker, so I can say whatever I want, but my reading of the kind of official reaction in Berlin behind the scenes was more like, oh gosh, another kind of a big idea brought forward by Macron, like the European Intervention Initiative, and nobody knows what's really behind it. So a big question mark again, and basically the idea first, and then it needs to be filled with life. And so the skepticism, as I noticed recently, because I'm also kind of active in civil society working on Europe, like the European Movement Germany. And so the opposition I encountered there was also quite striking. People just, because I'm actually much less skeptical than I think the average German is. I think it's well worth giving it a try. I like the idea that the UK likes it and that one could work with the UK in that framework. But questions I frequently encounter here are like, so we already have the Council of Europe as a broader club. Where is the difference? So why do we even have the Council of Europe? Why don't we fill that with life instead of having another club? Or when it comes to that idea of a parking lot, kind of that countries that seek membership are then kind of stuck in a holding pattern forever, that faces a lot of opposition in Germany. So the whole idea of making it a second class or second best solution for the Western Balkans or Ukraine is not really met with a lot of sympathy here. And so I think you need to convince the Germans that an additional framework makes sense and is different than the Council of Europe or the EU or the G7 or any other format that we already have. And so I always encourage everybody to kind of be constructive and to fill it with life, because it's still so much open to discussion what it should all be about. And I think the Chancellor recently has put this Azerbaijan-Armenia question, has put that forward. And so I really hope that the Germans will embrace the European political community. But then again, like on the European Intervention Initiative, I think there are some countries quite suspicious that the Germans only joined to be Trojan horses and to basically undermine it from within, which of course is not true. But so I hope that the Germans find a constructive way. But I can also understand the skepticism. I mean, nobody so far has come up with a convincing idea what this should be about and why we need an additional framework and why we cannot, for example, make the Council of Europe work better as a framework. So where is the difference and why do we need it? That is basically what is I think very much discussed here still. And so that's why you see this lukewarm approach in Germany.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Jana. Then I wanted to check in with Mathieu again, because Rem just touched on the US, the topic of the US and how things are viewed from there. How could you give us a brief insight into how the EPC, but also the kind of broader patchwork of especially security alliances, how that is seen from a US point of view?
Well, to come back on what Rem said, I think I really liked his question on what if a very different administration changes its course on China and becomes even more assertive. I think the problem here is not as much the strategic outlook of the integrated review, but it's the practical cooperation through AUKUS, for instance. I mean, this puts the UK on the long-term alignment with the US, and so they are, as we say in French, pieds et poings liés, like they're totally tied with the US policy in the Indo-Pacific. In fact, even if they want to have their own approach, I mean, this is a very long-term commitment. Then I would also echo what Georgina said, that from a US think tank perspective, we can see on a daily basis the beauty contest among Europeans to be the closest ally of the US administration, because this US administration is frequentable, and it's good to be and what we see, I think, at least the UK, through its strategic thinking and through this work on the integrated review and its historic ability to come up with its own strategies, is certainly more equipped than other Europeans to face a different US administration and maybe devise its own policies, whereby we see in other, especially on the eastern part of Europe, but I would argue also to some extent in Germany, kind of being blind of the possible change of policies in the US, and considering that US commitment, renewed commitment, as we have seen in the context of Ukraine, is a lasting commitment, and this is something that we all hope for, but our predictability and visibility is not more than a year and a half. So this is, I think I'm more concerned about other European countries than the UK itself.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Mathieu. In the meantime, maybe we can expand a bit more on that later on. But in the meantime, we have a question in the Q&A function, which is related to the upcoming meeting of the EU-UK Parliamentary Partnership Assembly. At least that's how I interpret PPA meetings, which will take place in July. And the question is if there are any major discussions or decisions in the last meetings before parliaments can change in the next elections in both the UK and the EU. So before a new mandate gets started, what are the last things that from the parliamentary side can be pushed through, and what are the key topics on the agenda? Maybe Georgina, maybe I can ask you first, also from a UK point of view, what you think there, what is the potential of that meeting, and what would be the key topics that the parliamentarians will talk about?
So thank you, Aline. I fear that I might disappoint you in that I haven't really focused that much, and partly the reason why I haven't focused so much on it is because I don't think that these meetings are being used strategically at all. This is very much it's supposed to be separate from the government EU talks, and it's supposed to give space to parliamentarians to identify areas where they can work more strategically together, to put, at least in the Westminster system, to put forward recommendations to the British government. And in a way, I think it sort of depends slightly on which MPs want to go. From what I hear, it's mostly actually MPs and members of the House of Lords who are sort of committed to a UK-EU relationship, so it's not entirely reflective of the constellation and positions inside the Parliament on the EU. So the thing is, I don't really. So my view is they're not being used strategically. Last time there was a lot of talk about Horizon and how do you improve and make sure that students can continue coming to the UK and British students can continue going to the EU. Real, actually, civil society issues. You know, how do you make sure that when it's holiday time, people don't spend 6 hours at the border trying to get across to go to France or wherever on holiday. So I don't know. I'll look into it, but I don't really know what the discussion points are going to be, how different they are. And you know, it would be nice to see sort of a parliamentary proposal. I know that Nathalie Loiseau on the EU side is very keen on sort of maintaining that relationship, is very keen to use it as a place where you can test recommendations as well. But yeah, I haven't been following it as closely perhaps as I should.
Thanks, Georgina. I was also wondering, Rem, you brought it up before, these opportunities for kind of informal exchanges on the sidelines of summits and things like that. would the value of a format like this mainly be in those elements, perhaps?
Look, every contact is good. But I think, it's still early days in the sense that I tried in my initial comments to illustrate how quickly we seem all to have turned the page and moved towards a better mood music regarding the EU-UK relationship. I think a lot of the contacts, both formal and informal, are also going to be about, well, is the TCA functioning? Is the trade agreement and the Windsor framework, is it being implemented as it should? What are new potential hiccups? How do things work on the Northern Irish border now that we have a new deal? So we are still very much also in the practical implementation phase of the Brexit set of agreements, and I think it might simply be a matter of time before we are able to really move to having that deeper or more strategic conversation that Georgina was hinting at.
Okay. Thanks. In the meantime, there's a second question that came in, which I think is again for Georgina, but if other people want to comment on it, please raise your hand. The question is, will the UK, I think I will interpret it slightly differently, would the UK prefer a bilateral relation to, for instance, Germany, but maybe we can also read it as France or the Netherlands, through industry or research, or vote for a general supranational cooperation? Is there a preferred option? Let's make it like in the long term.
So I don't work for the British government, so I'm just gonna caveat that. But I did spend an awful long time, as most panelists on this call, observing the ins and outs and twists and turns of Brexit. So I mean, it was on the table, right? During the Brexit negotiations, the EU wanted closer cooperation and research. Was even some openness to industry. We heard from REM, the sort of Netherlands, and from Jana, Germany's kind of willingness to be more open on EU-led initiatives and include third countries. And the UK government at the time rejected that because it wanted a hard form of Brexit. It wanted it just to be in the nuts and bolts, and everything else was fluff, and it was not necessary. Now you've got changes on that, but the problem is it's much easier to negotiate when you're negotiating than adding on later, because of course there's always going to be like trade-offs. It's okay, well if we grant you greater, if the as the EU, they could say, well, if we grant British institutions access to our research programs, what do we get in return? And so I think you both need a massive push. You've heard the UK government, Sunak government say that they would welcome a more constructive relationship with the EU on research and access to Horizon. But then you have rollbacks, and you certainly have some very ardent MPs in Rishi Sunak's party that don't want anything else. So I think because of the parliamentary constraints and because of the complexity of negotiating additional things, I think the UK will try and push for a bilateral approach. The limits with that is that there are some things that member states won't agree to do bilaterally because they think it will undermine EU cohesion. And I think all the panelists mentioned how important that was to different EU governments. I think there'll be some openness, like you've seen, but France and the UK have agreed to kind of explore how they can further nuclear cooperation. So it will be on a case-by-case basis, and really whether it serves national, but I think also ultimately EU interest. And I know around the Franco-British summit, France was talking to other EU governments to make sure that no announcement was going to be a red flag. So I think the UK would like it, but is not sure, doesn't know if it has enough support for a more constructive relationship with the EU on industry and research and everything. So it will opt for a bilateral track, but I'm not sure it will be as successful. So who knows? It depends on whether there's a major shift in approach in London, but at the moment I don't suspect that that's where we go.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for that. And then sorry,
Yeah, well, perhaps just one thing to flag. again, here the UK and the EU are violently in alignment in terms of the need for industrial policy in response to the US Inflation Reduction Act, or how to reduce dependencies on China or Russia. And so on the face of it, this would push towards greater cooperation in terms of industrial activities between the UK and the EU, whether that be individual European countries or the EU as a whole. The problem is, however, and I come back to the point I made regarding the functioning of the TCA, we all know that state aid was a massive bone of contention during the UK-EU negotiations. And so this might actually be a tripwire for greater tensions, the whole notion of industrial policy or industry cooperation. And I'm not in this call to be a Cassandra and to say all the things that could go wrong, but I do think that we're not out of the woods yet in terms of where the relationship is going, simply because the UK is no longer inside the EU, and therefore different rules will apply to it from a European point of view in terms of how it deals with its state aid. And that could potentially create additional friction. And you see some of that already emerging in terms of the British push for dishing out the cash in support of particular vulnerable sectors. This is the same thing that the Europeans are doing, I know, but still, I'm in a wait and see mode to see how the TCA, how robust the TCA is to deal with things like this, rather than in the mode that I expect deeper industrial tie-ups between the UK and for instance Germany or any other member state.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. As a last topic, I briefly wanted to come back to something that Mathieu and Rem also commented on earlier. So the transatlantic relationship and also the position. So the kind of the relations with China in that light. Rem mentioned earlier that the UK will have to kind of show its color at some point. That right now they've doubled down on the transatlantic relationship, but at some point the interests might diverge there. I think it might be interesting to hear a bit more about how that is also seen in other countries, that divergence from the US in the transatlantic relationship. Maybe Jana, could you give us an insight in the German thinking about that? Like, to what extent would Germany, how much is Germany aligned with the US at this point, and how will this develop in the future, you think?
So I've recently written a paper on exactly that, because my argument and that of an American colleague was that the Europeans, by and large, became much more dependent on the United States because of Russia's war against Ukraine, for several reasons. First, because German and European militaries have been put to the test. And I think the war revealed, particularly in my country, but I think also in other countries, how much we have cut defense spending and how much we have not invested in functioning capabilities in recent years. So it was a rather rude awakening. And I would argue that without the United States support for Ukraine, when it comes to weapon supplies, quickly, the Ukraine would no longer exist as a sovereign country. So I think we see a strengthening of NATO, but in NATO, the United States is by far the most capable country and has by far the most resources. So we are more dependent now. Also, we will cement our dependence on the United States now, especially in Germany, because with the additional money to beef up our military capabilities, we are investing in American capabilities. So there was basically the decision taken in Germany, and it was a dilemma between what do we want? Do we want to invest in European capabilities? Do we want to produce them or procure them collectively, buying from European companies? and maybe invest in development, or do we want to buy what is ready and what we know is functioning? And because of the need and the urgency, the German government has prioritized to buy off the shelf. So there was this commitment to buy the F-35, but also a heavy transport helicopter from the United States, and various other capabilities. We are creating long-term dependencies here, because, yeah, if we buy F-35 now, we kind of that creates path dependencies, and basically there is not endless money, and the Germans are experiencing this for the first time now as well, that resources are very limited and one needs to prioritize. So there is a development that leads us to getting more dependent on the United States. At the same time, the German government has very much embraced the renewed leadership role that the United States has played in Europe after the withdrawal in Afghanistan and AUKUS, which has put the transatlantic relationship into question from a German perspective. It was a huge shock for many Germans, especially the Afghanistan withdrawal. But now, with the deep commitment to support Ukraine, basically trust has come back, and I think a certain laziness, I would say, has come back as well, to take the new, very comfortable and cozy situation. I mean, just the transatlantic relationship, not the war in Europe, of course, but as something that is somewhat that people take for granted. So, and you see this kind of, you know, when you look at how decisions were made in Germany right after the war started to this day, I would argue that Scholz's closest partner was always Joe Biden, and not a European head of state and government. The Biden administration was basically the guiding star for the German government. And you see this not only with the tank decision, which was kind of closely connected to the United States moving in lockstep, but you see it throughout the decision-making process, that the kind of, and also that Olaf Scholz and Joe Biden see the war through similar lenses when it comes to fear of escalation, when it comes to the boiling the frog approach, or this kind of how they basically balance support for Ukraine, but also not becoming a war party, not waging World War III accidentally. So very close alignment and decisions that cement the dependence in a long-term perspective. At the other side, you hear in Berlin very often behind closed doors the 2024 war scenario. It's not that the Germans are just closing their eyes. They know the danger, and they are thinking about hedging. And I think the Chancellor actually is still committed to making the European Union a stronger geopolitical actor. He has said this at numerous occasions, lastly in Strasbourg in front of the European Parliament, but he's framing it differently than Macron. That is my last point. He's not saying, I want the EU to be a third pole or a third world power. He talks about the Europeans' need to become a stronger actor, to also become a better partner to the United States. So he frames it as a double-edged approach. So it's basically the same working plan. So it's about becoming more resilient, less dependent also on China when it comes to supply chains, becoming more militarily capable as Europeans. But he's not framing this as something that we need to do in order to become more independent. He's not even, I mean, he's still talking about European sovereignty, but far less. He's never talking about strategic autonomy. But I think all that is also a plan to create a more geopolitical, stronger European Union, to hedge against a US administration that might become less interested in Europe. So yeah, that is how it is seen here. And the IRA has created some shock waves. And when it comes to China, I would say, when I also look at what the chancellor says, there is a reluctance to follow the US too closely when it comes to China. I mean, there is, I think, a changed threat perception on the German side of things, so that the Europeans or Germans have every reason to look at China kind of differently. But this idea that we cannot be dragged into a conflict because of the United States, I think that resonates with the Germans. But as you've seen with the visit, with the criticism of Macron's visit, it was not well received how Macron acted in Beijing.
Yeah, thanks, Diana. I think that was a good kind of summary of the Berlin thinking. But I think that I mean, there are many different ways of reaching that independence or autonomy or sovereignty or Handlungsfähigkeit or whatever people want to call it. But it seems that the general direction is quite clear also in many other European countries. Unfortunately, we don't have time for any further questions or comments anymore. So I'm afraid I have to wrap up. I'm really happy that we did manage to cover a lot of ground. We spoke about the different developments in the UK, in Germany, France, Netherlands, the potential for cooperation, European political community, transatlantic, and even a bit of EU-China relations. So a big thank you to all the speakers for your insights and your comments. Very thankful also that you could make it at this time on a Tuesday evening. Thanks also to the partners that were involved in organizing this event. So the CASSIS Center at the University of Bonn, the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University, the Sirice Institute at the Sorbonne, and from the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, it was also the Nordrhein-Westfalen office that was involved in this. Thank you also to everyone in the audience. Glad you could join, and we hope to see you at some of the future editions of our European Strategic Dialogue series. On that note, I'll hand over to Dirk, who just put up his hand. So maybe for a final note to you, Dirk.
Just one thing, because I heard somebody saying in the beginning, it's good to be together, but it would be even nicer to be together in a room. So perhaps we could have something like this in a year or so in Brussels with you, Jeroen. And I think for Rem, it might be good. From London, it's possible. I hope, Jana, you could consider coming to Brussels for an event. I found that discussion here today pretty pertinent, and I would propose that we try to do something like this together in a room in a year further down the road. Thank you very much for everybody to joining us today. Thank you.